Okay, thank you, Elka, and welcome everybody. My name's Brett Mills, and I'm really pleased to be chairing this session on rewriting early histories of television. Unfortunately, one of the speakers who was scheduled for today, Andy Lawrence, unfortunately can't be here. But that's fine because we've got two excellent speakers who can contribute to the discussion. So that means, I think I've said to both of you, if your papers are slightly long, I'll be a bit lax in chairing so you can have a bit more time because we've got more time in session. But also, of course, that means we've got more time for discussion at the end. I think everybody who's not presenting has got their cameras off, so that's great. If you can also make sure your microphones are off as well during the talks, that would be good too. And at the end, those of you who are willing and able to put your cameras on for the discussion, I think that really helps two speakers so that they've got friendly human faces to be speaking to. And a reminder that also there's the chat box. I think so far every session I've been to in this conference, the chat box has been very, very lively during the Q&A, but also during the paper. So comments, questions, stick everything in there, and I'll try and keep an eye on that and include all of that as well. So with that, I'll move over to our first speaker, which is Carl Sweeney from the University of Wolverhampton. And so, Carl, I'll pass to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brett. And I'd just like to say a big thanks to Elka for organising such a great conference. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, hopefully you should be seeing my PowerPoint now.
Yes.
Adam West as Batman there.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like to start actually by reading you the beginning of an article from the Iowa City Press Citizen that was published in 2006. Now, this article is not actually about Adam West, although it does refer to him. This article is actually about pumpkins, and it starts like this. So, pumpkins are the Adam West of the food world. You remember Adam West. He was the B-movie actor who briefly became a big star when he played Batman on the 1960s TV program of the same name. West played the part of Batman from 1966 to 1968 and never had another serious role. He was typecast and destined to spend the next 20 years of his career making guest appearances at car shows. Pumpkins can relate. So to clarify, the author is suggesting that pumpkins are typecast because their traditional usage in pies obscures their versatility as an ingredient in a manner that parallels the determining effect that Batman has on West's image, which can be considered the defining characteristic of his stardom. So nevertheless, where the interdependence of a television actor and a specific role can be observed, it need not be understood as a uniformly limiting relationship. So in this paper, I evaluate Adam West as an archetypal example of a star closely associated with a single role. Now, in terms of analysing this for a star studies theoretical framework, the primary challenge is that stardom is traditionally associated with cinema actors, especially in historic cases. For instance, John Ellis, writing Invisible Fictions, argues that the small screen may be inherently unsuited to creating stars. So television, in Ellis's view, cannot produce a play between the ordinariness and extraordinariness of its performers, unlike cinema. Someone appearing on television then is not a paradoxical figure, but rather a known and familiar person. Nevertheless, significant interventions have since addressed the idea of television stardom. For instance, in her analysis of Sex and the City's Sarah Jessica Parker, Deborah Jermyn identifies the need for new theoretical models through which to examine American television's relationship to stardom, on the basis that old hierarchies have shifted due to broader shifts in celebrity culture and the growth of quality TV. So in this conception, high-profile figures from film and television now stand on a more equal footing. Therefore, Jermyn asks whether it is time to revisit the notion that stardom proper, i.e. as it has come to be constructed on a cinematic basis, must emerge from a succession of separate roles. So part of Jermyn's assessment is that whilst American television has long provided global reach, it is only now that it can bestow true stardom because the reach is combined with a higher degree of kudos. However, the particular arrangements of American television between approximately 1960 and 1980 arguably served as an especially potent breeding ground for a certain type of television stardom. So this was a period when the networks could command astonishing viewing figures before their grip on mass audiences started to loosen. So you had a scarceness of viewing options during this time frame, as well as the emergence of repeats as a quintessential televisual form, and the solidification of the cultural tradition of American programs being exported to other nations such as the UK. So in conjunction, these factors helped cement the association between primetime TV stars and popular characters. Where this becomes the dominant element in a star's image, the term signature role TV star can be employed to refer to an actor whose image is primarily defined by their appearance as one particular character on a television series. So I think Adam West is an apt choice to interrogate this type of stardom further, because he embodies not just the ambivalences of being associated with a signature TV role, but also the advantages. So to expand on this, I'm going to draw upon Richard Dyer's seminal star studies methodology. Through his concept of the structured polysemy, Dyer identifies several areas where audiences encounter a star's constructed image in media texts. For the purposes of today, I'm just going to restrict my comments to two areas of this. I'm going to spend most time on the category of criticism and commentary to demonstrate how a signature role TV star's image can be seen both in terms of stasis and change. But before I get there, I want to quickly discuss West's image as constructed through his on-screen appearances. So I'll start by contextualizing the Batman series, which was broadcast on ABC between 1966 and 1968. Hopefully some of you are familiar with it. In simple terms, it concerns, as you might expect, the crime-fighting exploits of millionaire Bruce Wayne and his youthful ward Dick Grayson, who strive to keep Gotham City safe from an assortment of colourful villains under the guise of their alter egos Batman and Robin. The programme was a mainstream phenomenon across the world, with its success seeing West enjoy the trappings of widespread renown, appearing on the cover of Life magazine and meeting the Pope. However, Batman's appeal, or initial appeal, was ultimately short-lived because the series was cancelled after a mere 3 seasons. Nevertheless, it's a programme that has had an enduring cultural presence. So one of its notable features, I think, is its presentation of the title character, who may appear to viewers as either a reassuring crime fighter or as a parody of authority figures, or potentially as both. In essence, the programme achieves this by making Batman unrelentingly moralistic and serious. So here we have a superhero who understands that only devious criminals would callously park in front of a fire hydrant, and that no loyal taxpayer would ever stoop to breaking the law. So the intention of the producers was that adults would find Batman's high-mindedness amusing, whereas children watching would not perceive this and would become caught up in the adventurousness on display. So this approach helped align the programme with the camp movement, a sensibility which, as Susan Sontag notes, is alive to a double sense in which some things can be taken. And West's stylized performances were a key factor in this mixed address because he exhibited both a steadfast seriousness and a deadpan comic timing that facilitated divergent interpretations of the programme as either quite a straightforward superhero drama or as a camp comedy. And I think part of the relevance of Batman's overall creative approach is that it occurred during a period in American history when prevailing patriarchal values were increasingly being challenged. So this was the era of the civil rights movement, protests against involvement in Vietnam, and so on. So Batman's polysemic address meant that it could be understood as either upholding or critiquing dominant values. So I think this is pertinent to West's overall star image because, as Dyer observes, star images function in relation to contradictions within and between ideologies. So I want to point to just one specific example of how this notion applies to West, which occurs in Batman's first episode, in which the Caped Crusaders' investigation takes him to a trendy nightclub. So after drinking a drugged glass of orange juice, Batman dances enthusiastically with Jill St. John's character Molly, gyrating his hips and moving his fingers across his eyes in a V formation. So this sequence became one of the most iconic moments of the series. It inspired a national dance craze. And it was also homaged many years later in Pulp Fiction. You might remember John Travolta and Uma Thurman dancing in that film. So according to West, the sequence was largely a result of his improvisation. He states in his memoir, 1994's Back to the Batcave, that the dance was nondescript as written, but he, and I quote, felt it should be a little more than that, and I worked it out on my own, made it a singular moment of madness inspired by the ongoing debate in the media about whether drug use was mind-expanding or debilitating. I wasn't trying to make a social statement. I just felt it would be funny and abstract. So I think West's statement is telling, because it suggests he was able to locate the register within which the program's straddling of ideologies would work most effectively. Now, as Dyer describes, some stars may embody values regarded as subversive, though the narratives in which they appear tend to recuperate rather than promote the rebellion they embody. So I think West is a suitable example of this because the program's formulaic narrative structure, and it was very formulaic, you would invariably see Batman and Robin triumph in the face of villainy, whilst the series' camp tone provided opportunities to West to both satirize patriarchal values and at times enact oppositional ones. So I think my point is that Dyer's observation that a defined star image bridges ideologies is applicable to West. However, this is usually less relevant to his later roles, because after Batman's cancellation, he was unable to parlay his success on TV into a lasting career as a mainstream leading man. Nevertheless, a significant aspect of his long and varied list of post-Batman credits is that they are marked by associations, direct or indirect, with his signature part. So I'll just go through this quite quickly, but he periodically returned to the role of Batman, especially in animation. So even as recently as 2017's film Batman vs. Two-Face, alongside William Shatner as Two-Face. Elsewhere, his persona acquired a self-reflexive edge. So in 1991's one-off TV special Look Well, for instance, West plays the star of a cancelled TV show who believes he now has the skills to fight crime in real life. A similar knowingness is evident in his touching guest turn in an episode of Batman the Animated Series, in which West plays Simon Trent, the aging lead of a fondly remembered superhero television series. And in a plethora of programs, including The Simpsons and The Big Bang Theory, West played exaggerated versions of himself, often in scenarios which evoked or referenced his earlier stint as Bruce Wayne. You can see on the picture there he's holding a Batman cup, if you look closely. Meanwhile, his long-running role as Mayor Adam West in the cartoon series Family Guy provides a variant on this trend. So West portrays himself as eccentric, possibly psychotic, but references to Batman are studiously avoided, which critic Alyssa Wilkinson describes as a kind of recurring joke by omission. So these post-heyday roles ensure that West fulfills Ellis's basic definition of a star, which requires an established persona to feed back into future performances. Whilst these latter-day roles are generally less significant to West's overall image, I think they signal that signature role TV stardom constitutes part of an ongoing process whereby the meanings attached to both a star and their flagship character vary in relation to a multitude of factors. So, to demonstrate some of the ways in which West's image fluctuated over time, I want to turn to the area of criticism and commentary. So when Batman first aired, West was generally seen in the press as an appropriate fit for the role. However, evaluations of his acting are often quite cursory in contemporaneous reviews of the programme, whereas other elements are foregrounded as being crucial to the series' appeal. So in reviews of the first episode, for instance, Frank Gorshin's performance as the Riddler gets a lot of praise, whilst West is often only mentioned in passing, or even not at all. Some reviews from 1966 don't refer to him in the slightest. In the case of his post-Batman career, assessing West's star standing in terms of criticism and commentary involves finding the clues, really, in coverage that is often quite piecemeal in nature, because the truth is that much of his later work went unnoticed by reviewers. Where they do mention West, it tends to be the case that allusions to things like his star status, his physical appearance, or his acting skills, they tend to function in relation to his signature role as Batman. So I'll just give you two quick examples of this, both of them which refer to West's performance in the 1993 comedy series Danger Theatre. So Joyce Millman contends that West looks a little lost without his grey bodysuit and bat cowl, and is more truly awful than knowingly campy, whilst David Biancoli asserts that West plays his part with a less deadpan delivery than he brought to Batman, and sometimes he overplays it. So I think the extent to which West's signature role stands as the dominant frame through which his exploits are interpreted is clear there, and that's a very common tendency. I think the overall shape of the broader Batman phenomenon is relevant too, because West's cultural standing was tied to these persistent associations. So I've also looked at materials that focus on other Batman narratives, because I think this is an important part of unpacking the specifics of how West's image was constructed. What tends to happen as later Batman films and television programs are released is that West becomes a mobile signifier whose name alone conjures associations with an unthreatening campiness that stands in opposition to modern variants on the Batman character. So this serves to bring West back into focus as a defining opposite. So, for example, in the case of Tim Burton's Batman Returns, the critic Jay Boyer judges that Michael Keaton imbues Batman with deep shadings that ward off the campy ghost of 1960s TV Batman Adam West. And this kind of thing becomes a common rhetorical trope, with such references indicating that eventually West becomes the main signifying element associated with the ABC series. And this did not appear to be the case in 1966. And I think the use of the word ghost in that quote is also quite noteworthy, because you do sometimes get a sense that West is haunting newer depictions of Batman. So essentially, West's cultural presence continued to exert an influence over receptions of other Batman texts, even in the case of those which were markedly dissimilar. So I think this notion of difference is especially pertinent to the film trilogy directed by Christopher Nolan, which started in 2005 with Batman Begins. So there's a sense in coverage of that film that West's Batman and Christian Bale's Batman represent opposing poles. And Bale himself prompted this interpretation, stating that actors playing Batman should either really send it up the way that Adam West did, or really delve deep into the demons in this character. So I think Bale rhetorically constructs West's idiosyncratic embodiment of the character as a logical complement to his own incarnation. And by doing so, he bestows a degree of validity on West, who had been maligned elsewhere. So you get various ways in which West is invoked in regards to other Batman texts. And I think they signify that his signature role stardom is, and this is in keeping with stardom in general, I think, it's dependent on an image that at times can be seen as inconsistent or incoherent. I think unlike with most other stars, though, the interesting thing is that the incoherence of West's image is linked quite squarely with a single role. And I think related to this is the fact that West's Batman series was often seen as unfashionable by critics, even as it went through several cycles of retroactive popularity due to television reruns. But what seems to happen is subtler appreciations of the program emerge over time, and you get an increasingly common factor whereby, whether grudgingly or otherwise, there's this identification that Batman is something of a televisual landmark. So an illustration of this occurs in Craig Brown's review in The Times in 1993, which describes the series as, in many ways, a forerunner of more self-consciously arty series such as Twin Peaks. Brown also refers to West as immortal, further observing that the great TV Batman has been superseded by the grim new Hollywood Batman. So I think in this case, the terms used equate the 1960s series and Adam West with an extraordinariness that is said to be absent in the new cycle of films. So I think we can read West's star image through the prism of the ordinary extraordinary binary or dichotomy more commonly associated with cinematic stardom, albeit in his case, this interplay is centered around a single role. In the case of criticism and commentary, this becomes most evident once Batman is reconsidered nostalgically, and I'll come back to this. Oh, I can't move this slide, hang on. There we go. So generally, West was critically reappraised in later years, with positive reevaluations of him often tied to new events, which provided a justification for critics to write about Batman. So when it would pop up somewhere new in repeats, or when it was released on DVD, which took a long time, it was finally released in DVD in 2014, I believe, and so on. And understandably, West's death in June 2017 also prompted an uncommonly close focus on his accomplishments. And some of this posthumous commentary reflects on his place within the broader Batman phenomenon. So Glenn Weldon, for instance, argues that the 1960s series and West's performance in particular are the reason anyone's talking about the character of Batman today. And Matt Zoller Seitz echoes this, positing that West's Batman / Bruce Wayne is and will always remain the single most important screen incarnation of the character, for better or worse. And writing in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Ryan Donovan Purcell argues that West articulated a particular set of American values that shaped a generation of young viewers. Now, in this interpretation, the program served as a moral compass for a generation, with West representing an active part of this because his performances emphasized human vulnerability. And I think, as I noted earlier, you can also read his image in more of a subversive manner. So I think that this supports the sense that his signature role image operates in kind of a liminal space between conflicting ideologies or worldviews. And the notion of West as both ordinary and extraordinary is also pertinent to coverage of his death, with a notable example being evident in Luke Thompson's memorial article. So Thompson says, "Somehow it was impossible to see him as a mere mortal, vulnerable as all human beings are to the passage of time itself. The news that one of our first great TV superheroes was felled by a short bout with leukemia hardly seems possible. Surely there was some magically medical bat spray, or a way he could biff, zap, pow his way out again. It was not to be." So through his figurative framing of West's demise, Thompson, I think, invokes notions of extraordinariness and ordinariness. On the one hand, you've got the prospect of West perishing, which is posited as unbelievable, because he would invariably escape from peril on Batman. Yet this is juxtaposed with the sad acceptance of his passing away. And more prosaically, Rob Hoerberger's remembrance of West in the New York Times Magazine also locates an ordinary, extraordinary paradox in relation to West's signature role performance. So in Hoerberger's words, the portrayal of Batman that West gave showed us that occasionally we need our superheroes to be a little more like us. So I think in relation to Jermin's suggestion that a contemporary star image can be theoretically constructed from a single televisual role, the example of Adam West supports the notion and indicates that this can be expanded to incorporate performers most associated with earlier eras of television. Although West ostensibly epitomizes Ellis's description of the actor-character balance on TV, whereby the performer's image is equated with that of the fictional role, his relationship with his signature role accrued new inflections over time. So I think while there is a tendency to think of a star image associated with a single role in terms of inertia, I think establishing the changes that take place over an extended period are important, because West's connection with Batman represented a constant variable as opposed to a fixed point. Meanwhile, the adjustments in his image can sometimes be read through the prism of the ordinary-extraordinary dichotomy more commonly associated with cinematic stardom. I've pointed to a few examples in this paper, but I think this is true in other areas too, such as publicity materials. And again, this applies across a broader chronological time frame than I think Jermin suggests in her analysis of Sarah Jessica Parker. So in a nutshell, West's standing in criticism and commentary text vacillates quite significantly, thereby demonstrating something that I think is true more broadly, namely that signature role television stardom need not be seen in terms of stasis, but rather as a dynamic process oriented around the durable core. All right, that's all. Thank you very much for listening. And I'll just stop sharing now. Okay.
Thank you, Carl. That was great. Thanks for a really detailed analysis of the case study and also inviting us to rethink issues of stardom and the history of stardom. So I look forward to that discussion on that later. Our second speaker now is Karen Murphy from the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. So I'll pass over to you, Karen.
All right, and I am going to start sharing my screen, and I hope that right now, let's see, you are looking at my title slide. Is it working?
That's correct. It's all good.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so thank you, Elka, so much for the organization of the conference, and I think that we're all going to find that there's a lot of kind of neat overlap between Carl's excellent paper and the work that I have here. So I'm just going to dive right in. My paper is about the United States television system between the 1960s and the 1980s, referred to by media historians as the classic network era or the classic network system. Michelle Hilms, Jason Mattel, and J. Fred McDonald are all media historians who have looked at the U.S. network structure from the perspective of like industry studies. they've characterized the classic network era as a time when the networks utilized oligopolistic control to minimize the financial risk associated with programming and to wrest maximum profits from sponsors and advertisers. This is a time period primarily characterized by close competition among the three national broadcast networks, and they're each seeking to profit by reaching the largest possible share of the national audience. Todd Gitlin's influential study Inside Primetime offers a sociological perspective on this era, analyzing extensive interviews with network executives about their expertise in the industry and their experience with programming. What I'm seeking to do in this paper and my work in general is utilize the archived papers of creative personnel to look at the way that archived papers offer a record and an additional avenue from which to approach an understanding of the possibilities and the challenges that characterized production and distribution at this time. And so I'd like to move into the specifics with my first example that I brought for you. And as I share slides, much of the imagery, a lot of the stuff that I brought to share are things that I pulled directly out of the archive papers of especially producers and sometimes writers. And so this little TV guide close-up came from the papers of the writer Alvin Barretts, who is the writer behind The Blue Men. In late 1958, the producer Herbert Brodkin wrote to Hubbell Robinson, the head of programming at CBS, about The Blue Men, which he was simultaneously producing for the acclaimed anthology series Playhouse 90 and pitching as a half-hour filmed drama series. Brodkin, an accomplished producer of live television drama, was adapting to the television industry's rapid changes at this time. Playhouse 90 had originally presented a new live play each week, but because this type of production was increasingly considered expensive and unwieldy, production had transitioned to a videotape format by 1957. Dramatic anthologies were critically acclaimed, but the networks increasingly expressed a preference for filmed series with continuing characters that might reliably draw a large audience. As filmed programming proliferated, the television industry's critics charged that the dynamic and challenging storytelling associated with the 1950s golden age was disappearing. And so Playhouse 90 would be considered a golden age show, and Herbert Brodkin is producing one Playhouse 90 at the same time that he's launching this Playhouse 90 story as a film television series, and that's what I'm going to show you next. So Brodkin's proposal for The Blue Men is a story about a father-son team of detectives, and it appears designed to bridge the gap between the old and new eras. The 90-minute play, scripted by Alvin Barretts, was scheduled to air on Playhouse in early 1959. In the meantime, Brodkin was preparing to shoot the 30-minute pilot, also scripted by Barretts, on film, anticipating that CBS would order it as a weekly series. Brodkin assured Hubbell Robinson at CBS that the planned production had no shortage of ideas for their central characters. Primetime television, including Playhouse 90, was increasingly produced in Southern California. In contrast, Brodkin proposed that each episode of the new filmed series would open with a shot of a New York City street. He further suggested that every opening shot would transition to a dramatic incident as quickly as possible, quote, even before sponsor identification, unquote. Brodkin's proposal demonstrates his understanding of the network's priorities as they invested in filmed programs. CBS was no longer interested in the slow buildups common in anthology drama. The network wanted programming that could grab and hold viewers' attention and keep them from changing the channel. At the same time, the networks were under scrutiny for their over-reliance on formulaic imitative programming. When Brodkin wrote to Robinson, the airwaves were already clogged with film, crime, and detective series. Brodkin positioned the series version of The Blue Men as desirable because it would be hard-hitting and honest, in contrast to, quote, the usual type of detective series, unquote. In other words, the series would embody both the quality appeal of a film detective series with the quality associated with its anthology predecessors and the general appeal of a filmed detective series with continuing characters. Brodkin established the independent production company Plautus to supply the show to CBS, and CBS changed the name to Brenner when they ordered the series because they thought the audience would be confused by the title The Blue Men. The audience wouldn't understand that blue men are police officers, and so they changed the title to Brenner. The series aired as a summer replacement, and it did not become a breakout success, but Plautus Productions continued to refine this model of development, drawing on material from anthology dramas in future series, including The Defenders, which is about lawyers, The Nurses, obviously about nurses, and the later series For the People is not based on an anthology drama, but by the time For the People, which is 1965, Plautus has this very clear social issues focused professionals model that they're using in series after series. Brenner was an early entry in a cycle of professional dramas, and you're looking at part of that cycle here, and I'm going to show you more. Brenner was an early entry in the cycle that emerged in the early network era. Producers like Brodkin, with deep roots in the live anthology form, brought their ideas about quality storytelling in line with the priorities of network control and mass appeal. The strategies that writers and producers employed to get their series on the air and attempt to ensure their continuation illuminate how creative personnel viewed the emerging network system. Professional dramas were positioned with pitches and promotions that emphasized their connections to prestigious programs like Playhouse 90 and Studio One. Their pitches proclaimed their authenticity in both storytelling and performance, and continually reiterated their distinction from the formulaic and repetitive telefilm series. By the early 1960s, there's a very broad public discourse about how television is bad. The producers of these shows are saying, well, television is bad, but our shows are quality. In terms of the relationship to formula, and actually I need to show you more professional dramas. And there are even more than these, but I wanted to have a whole bunch on one slide so you could get a sense of the genre cycle all in one place. The Nurses, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about, in its third season became The Doctors and the Nurses. And so that's the explanation behind that entry in the top line there. So these are series that position themselves as being anti-formula, but they definitely utilized an evident formula. The central characters in Brenner were a father and son, but stories did not emphasize a mentorship dynamic between the two. Instead, the template for the professional drama in which a young professional would benefit from the guidance of a wise elder was established by the first three successes in this genre. Brenner was not a success. And so the first three successes are The Defenders, Dr. Kildare, and Ben Casey, which all premiered in 1961, and they were all hits in their first season, okay? So these are the shows that other producers imitate as they try to make their own professional drama that follows along the lines of an established success. And so in the template, the young professional benefits from the guidance of a wise elder. Herbert Brodkin produced The Defenders. This is an adaptation of a Studio One drama about a team of father-son defense attorneys, and it aired on CBS. Norman Felton produced Dr. Kildare, which is an update on the classic Max Brand medical intern character for NBC. And James Moser produced Ben Casey, another medical drama for ABC. Both Kildare and Casey were young protagonists benefiting from the wise counsel of their medical mentors, Dr. Gillespie and Dr. Zorba, respectively. All three of these series were popular with viewers, and their success informed the imitative series that would follow in their wake, seeking to duplicate their popularity. These three provided elements that became a template for producers who were trying to sell their pitches and for network executives who inserted themselves into the development process as they try to manufacture hit series. The goal is to reach as many people as possible. We know that people like Ben Casey. How can we make your new show more like Ben Casey in order to try to appeal to viewers? Archival evidence, including the papers of Brodkin, the writer-creator Reginald Rose, producer Norman Felton, and others, demonstrate that program creators view their series as socially important, but they were also centrally aware that audiences demonstrated a much stronger preference for escapist fare. Comedies are far more popular than these dramas, and producers know that. Records related to the production of these professional dramas help to demonstrate how producers balance the desire for socially impactful programming with the system's reliance on mass audience appeal. The program creators and producers behind the early network era's professional dramas negotiated a contradiction. They insisted that their work was distinct from typical television, while also assuring network executives that the products that they delivered would be substantially similar to established successes. And so I'd like to move to talking about writers' guides. In the early network era, it was common for dramas to be scripted by freelance writers. The process was similar from series to series. A producer or a script editor worked with the writers of individual scripts in order to ensure that each episode provided consistent characterization and conformed to the same basic storytelling goals. Television historian John Krasuski has explained the shift from the writer-centered anthology of the 1950s, the Playhouse 90 model, to the producer-centered series drama of the 1960s, writing, quote, "Writers went from being the architects of the storytelling process to people who were given a blueprint and asked to build a product someone else designed," unquote. Story guides provide a window into how creative personnel use the identifiable and repeatable elements of the professional drama as both storytelling advantages and promotional tools. And so here I have for you little snippets of the start of the story guides for my first 3 hit shows, my 1961 hit shows. The Defenders, Ben Casey and Dr. Kildare, were the first breakout successes in the cycle, and so their story guides provide a helpful window into what series creators deemed to be necessary and appealing elements. These materials were prepared by different writers working at separate companies, but they manifest striking similarities. Each guide describes the teacher-student dynamic that is central to the series storytelling. A guide to the characters and setting for the Defenders asserts, quote, "The relationship between father and son is part of the hard core of this series," unquote. The series' aim, according to its projection, is to find conflict and drama in the relationship of the 2 central characters, both to each other and to the law, rather than in the guest stars who appear as defendants or other continuing members of the supporting cast. Each guide references the idealism associated with the younger protagonist character, tying this trait to his age and the extent of his professional experience. E. Jack Newman is the creator of Dr. Kildare, and his guide to Dr. Kildare describes him as, quote, "a tough idealist, practical and honest, a serious-minded young man with a goal to achieve," unquote. The guides for all 3 series note that the central characters will have personal lives and that stories will be more focused on personal dynamics than on professional procedures. Moser suggested to writers that a good story for Ben Casey, quote, "should be 2/3 to 3/4 personal human interest and 1/3 to 1/4 concerned directly with medical material," unquote. The guides also share an emphasis on city settings and the storytelling flexibility that a large and varied population can offer. Ben Casey is the chief resident in neurosurgery at a 4,000-bed county general hospital located in a large metropolitan area somewhere in the United States. City is never specified. Dr. Kildare reports for duty at Blair General Hospital, a fully equipped facility affiliated with both a medical school and a nursing school in an unnamed city of 1 million people. Writers were advised that stories could be set inside and outside the hospital. The Prestons of the Defenders have offices in New York, quote, "within reasonable proximity of the courts," unquote, but the projection notes that episodes need not include courtroom scenes. It doesn't have to take place in the courtroom. You can have a whole episode of the Defenders and they never go to court. Taken together, the story guides demonstrate a remarkably uniform approach to the continuing character series. All 3 programs were designed to use the perspective of a young professional to explore an institutional environment. They built in the potential for interpersonal conflict by including an older mentor who could alternately guide, frustrate, appreciate, and butt heads with a younger protege. Each guide seeks to maximize storytelling flexibility. Writers were encouraged to use the professional setting or move outside of it, and to use established supporting characters or invent new ones. The authors of each of these documents also spelled out how their series would be distinct from typical television. The creators who prepared these guides noted a desire to approach storytelling differently than the already available primetime options. One of the clear priorities that emerges in these guides is an emphasis on sophisticated storytelling. The projection for the Defenders stipulates that for its episodes, the obvious formula will be avoided. The guide for Kildare writers advises, "think fresh. Here is a show which is distinctively different. Let's keep it that way." Moser's Guide to Ben Casey explains that the show is primarily a series of adult, honest-to-God stories about people in medicine, specifically young doctors in training. He goes on to provide examples of the tropes for writers to avoid. Quote, "Let's put aside the time-honored medical plot of the saga of the beautiful ballerina who will never dance again unless Ben Casey and his friends perform this miraculous bit of surgery. Or the tearful tale of how Casey saved the life of Angelina, the 9-year-old daughter of the nice Italian woman who runs a spaghetti kitchen around the corner from the hospital and gives free meals to poverty-stricken interns and residents." The other guides do not present such specific examples of conventional tropes and cliches to be avoided, but they do all place an emphasis on accuracy, realism, and authenticity. The success of these 3 series inspired others to follow their example, and the story guides from later entries in the genre cycle show this influence. The story guide for the nurses notes that Alden General is a large hospital employing medical professionals in all specialties and serving all types of patients. This would allow for a maximum flexibility in storytelling, in contrast to the kind of limitation that might be imposed by tying the nurses to a particular department or ward. The guide also notes that senior nurse Liz Thorpe and student Gail Lucas are the lead characters, and the important thing is that the crisis must pivot around them if possible. The Nurses was produced by a completely different team than Ben Casey, but its story guide provides a notably similar emphasis on personal storytelling. Like Moser's Guide, it instructs writers that, quote, "the show is not primarily medical," unquote. This raises the question of what its stories should be, and the guide explains, "We do not wish our nurses to be private eyes, rushing off to find the missing evidence. We do not wish our nurses to be badgered by gangsters because one of their number is recuperating from a slug." Instead, the guide calls for dramas which have themes of importance. Dramatic interest is also a stated goal, but the guide asks writers to find it within interpersonal dynamics and the ordinary demands of the nursing profession. The professional drama is defined in opposition to the conventions that viewers were familiar with from other popular genres. Another strategy that producers used to draw attention to their professional dramas was the exploitation of controversial subject matter. This area represents a balancing act because a number of network system forces worked to discourage series from exploring controversial areas. George Lefferts, producer of the psychiatric drama Breaking Point, promoted the fact that its first season would explore themes related to bigotry, abortion, compulsive sex, and youth rebellion. This is in 1963. Each episode of Breaking Point had to navigate a process that involved network approval, standards and practices revisions, and vetting by psychologists. In addition, the series hoped to appeal to at least 30% of the available viewing audience, and this kind of success was just one factor in maintaining the show's support by advertisers. So Lefferts does not include it on his list of themes that you can see here. This is from an op-ed that George Lefferts wrote about the show. He doesn't include it on the list, but the season also had an episode that dealt with homosexuality. And that episode brought the series to the attention of Senator Dodd's congressional investigations into television at this time. So why, considering all these obstacles, did dramatic programs attempt to treat controversial subjects? If you know it's going to draw, network scrutiny and, congressional queries, why would you have a show about homosexuality, when you know that there's that pressure? Producers gambled that a special episode on a controversial topic of general interest provided a way to reach a larger than usual audience and impress them with quality drama. It was a method to get attention. The Defenders provided a model with its famous first season episode about abortion titled The Benefactor. The series sponsors refused to participate, but the CBS network received positive coverage for supporting the series, and a replacement sponsor was located, and audiences turned out in droves. This episode of The Defenders was a huge success that every newspaper wrote about and people were talking about. It was an audience success, and CBS was praised for its courage. And so this happens in 1962 in the show's first season, and it provides a model for other shows to follow. The Nurses In its first season, which is a year after The Defenders, this is Herb Brodkin's next show, the nurses included episodes on capital punishment, abortion, and syphilis was thought to be a topic that was impossible for TV at this time. The college drama Channing included episodes about Vietnam, homosexuality, and racial prejudice. Prolific producer Norman Felton described his take on the balance necessary for a dramatic series in a letter explaining the goals of The 11th Hour, his series about psychologists. He wrote, "In order to reach the millions necessary to stay in prime time, we are trying to use some showmanship to build plays high in entertainment value and as often as possible, tackling important matters on a social plane. In order to put these special episodes forward, producers had to," oh, there's the 11th hour. You see a little Rorschach blot there, but I got to sneak right past it. In order to put these special episodes forward, producers had to sometimes fight bruising battles. Part of the impetus was certainly the desire to address the mass audience with the kind of entertainment that might also educate them. But more centrally, it was worth the risk because the strategy could help to build the audience for a series. East Side, West Side, a series about New York social workers that aired for only one season, had trouble finding its footing. Critics supported it, but the series' bleak subject matter made it less appealing to both viewers and to advertisers. The series' most famous episode is Who Do You Kill?, in which a young Black couple in Harlem are shattered when their baby dies after being bitten by a rat in their infested tenement building. CBS made the producers verify that it was possible to die this way and that it had happened in New York before moving forward with the episode. Those connected with the production indicate that they knew it was an excellent script from the beginning. Talent Associates, the company behind the series, devised an innovative promotional campaign to sell it. They sent the 75-page script to 100 influential Americans, asking them to read it, recommend the broadcast to others, and commit to watching it when it aired. This campaign did not save the series, but it does demonstrate that producers felt that dealing with social issues, in this case, racism, poverty, urban decay, and the failure of the social safety net, it was promotable. It was something that you could promote about your series. This was an occasion where every critic who was reviewing television for newspapers around the country re-reviewed East Side, West Side on the occasion of this episode. It was promotable. I also want to just briefly, quickly mention that one of the results of the campaign was that Senator Jacob Javits talked about East Side, West Side in the Congressional Record. And then the producers of East Side, West Side took out a full-page ad in Variety to showcase that testimony and how the importance of the show was something that was being discussed in Congress. A second brief example, because I'm getting close to concluding, but a second brief example that aired around the same time comes from the high school drama Mr. Novak. The network system made it difficult for dramatic series to focus on issues related to racial politics, especially integration. Civil rights struggles were ongoing, and the question of integration seemed to be divisive. Sponsors did not wish to be associated with programming that affiliate stations might refuse to air, and programming, quite frankly, that sponsors might refuse to support. E. Jack Newman, who created Mr. Novak, wrote the episode A Single Isolated Incident for the show's first season. It tells the story of a Black high school student who is accosted by a group of white students on her way to school. They throw garbage at her and tell her that she is not welcome. This is part of a concerted campaign on the part of approximately a dozen students at the integrated Jefferson High that is the focus of the show. During the script's development process, network executives and the Standards and Practices Department asked that the show make clear that the school had always been integrated and that prior to this, it had never presented a problem. In fact, the episode's title was changed from The Incident to A Single Isolated Incident in order to emphasize that Jefferson High was not meant to represent the American public schools that were struggling with the issue of integration in 1963. Feedback from network censors clearly indicates that they wish to avoid depicting institutionalized racism. Instead, they wanted the drama to tell a story about how a few bad apples could be overcome by the goodwill of the majority. Newman's series maintained a close collaborative relationship with the National Education Association. A panel of educators reviewed each of the series scripts, but this was also a promotional relationship. Newman clearly hoped that the thousands of educators represented by the NEA would watch his series and encourage their students to do the same. The panel of educators who reviewed a single isolated incident asked Newman to include clarification that although administrators recognized that integration caused tensions elsewhere, at Jefferson High, the situation had always been so well in hand that it never caused any problem until now. They affirmed that the episode was dramatic and moving, but they shared the network's concerns in terms of telling a story that might be read as broadly applicable to current strife in America's public schools. Newman's papers show that from a very early stage in its development, this episode was planned as a special event for the series, quote, worthy of all possible promotion, unquote. It was not easy for producers like David Susskind behind East Side, West Side, and E. Jack Newman behind Mr. Novak to get dramatic episodes about controversial social issues from the planning process to the broadcast audience of tens of millions of people in the early network era. Dramatic producers invested in this as a strategy, not for every episode, but for some, because they genuinely believed in the power of television and its influence on the public. Centrally, they also believed that this might help them to serve the commercial ends of the medium. An episode that people would talk about, that congressmen might discuss on the Senate floor, was one way to help a dramatic series prove its value outside of the oppressive industry focus on ratings numbers and viewership estimates. Thank you. I failed to show you one last thing. This is the all possible promotion quote. So a couple months before a single isolated incident airs, they're having an internal discussion at MGM where they say, you know, this is absolutely special and we want to, it's a powerful episode and we want to proceed with as much publicity and exploitation as possible. All right, now I definitely showed you everything.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you for introducing me to loads of programs I never knew existed. There's loads of stuff I want to go and watch now, and that's a brilliant outcome of a conference, if nothing else. I'll invite anybody who's willing and able to put their camera on to do so, as I said at the beginning, so that Carl and Karen have some faces to look at. So I see Elka's here and others. That's great. That makes us feel much more like a community. So thank you for that. I mean, there's some questions I want to ask, but I'll open up to the floor first to see if there's questions, comments and responses. And obviously also invite Carl and Karen if you want to if you have responses to one another's papers or questions you have for each other, then obviously you're welcome to do that too. So are there any questions or comments to start off?
Can I bring one up for Karen? So I thought it was interesting that I was talking about stars of the 60s and 70s, and of course there was that overlap with your paper. Do you think that, because there's kind of the idea that you go through with television, American television, you go through the first golden age of the 50s, and then you're into the vast wasteland before you get to the second golden age. Do you think that's relevant to the kind of series you're describing as well?
Absolutely. And so the sort of historical discussion, one of the things I'm writing about, the sort of historical discussion around Newton Minow and the Vast Wasteland speech in 1961, this is multifaceted because Newton Minow was an FCC chair and he gave this speech. And in the years afterwards, he kind of said, like, everybody had the wrong takeaway from that. People focused on the fact that I said, you turn on your TV and you sit and watch it all day and you're going to find a vast wasteland. But they missed the part where I said, you know, television has all this potential for educating us and changing our society, and television can be all these wonderful things. Well, these producers behind the professional dramas that I was just talking about, these are all people who are aware of the vast wasteland speech. When they make their pitches to networks, they talk about, don't you want to have a quality television series that shows that you're trying to serve the public? You're trying to, you know, feed the mission of television. So as mass comm historians started writing about the vast wasteland era, the 1960s as the era of the vast wasteland. One of the things that they typically conclude is that Newton Minnow's efforts didn't end up having much effect on entertainment programming. There's this expansion of money spent on news and documentary programming at the networks, but like not that much impact on entertainment programming. And the people who made entertainment programming, they would have argued with that at the time. So like the trade press, 1962, 1963, 1964, they're like, this is the season of Newton Minnow. This is the year 1963 is the year where all of this effort to address his criticisms comes to culmination. Every night of the week, we have a social issues drama on TV. So the people who worked in the industry did feel that they were making efforts to address those criticisms.
Yeah. I definitely think it's relevant to the Batman series because I think viewed from a certain prism, it can be seen as kind of epitomizing those kind of vast wasteland tendencies in the sense of it was extremely formulaic. It was seen at the time, there was some concern that it was causing school children to go into the playground and kind of beat each other up, that kind of thing. It was on twice a week as well.
Yes.
I think Tuesdays and Wednesdays. It had the voiceover, tune in again tomorrow, same bat time, same bat channel. And I think those sort of associations with it being that kind of television program linger for quite a long time. And you need to almost get a generation away from it before it's kind of rehabilitated as an emblem of more positive things about 60s television, which is kind of interesting. Yeah.
Well, one of the things, if I can ask a question back about Batman, but I'm not quite sure how to formulate this as a question. One of the things that I see emerging, especially in the early network era, is the desire to profit from merchandising. Because a show in its initial run is not really gonna make money, and the idea is like to stay on the air long enough that you can go into syndication. And with Batman, the huge advantage there would be you're already doing 2 episodes a week, you're going to go into syndication twice as fast, right? But it's also a pretty clear priority. Like making Batman is about selling t-shirts and lunchboxes and toys. Is that, I know I'm not formulating as a question, is that something that you're thinking about or finding in terms of like the Adam West stardom, cementing him as a face and a name that everybody knows? Part of that is the merchandising process in addition to the show, right?
It is. And I think what's really interesting and what I didn't quite anticipate when I started to look at it is that Batman fad in 1966 was incredibly brief, actually. The program starts, it was a mid-season replacement, so it didn't start until January of 1966 in the United States. By March, you're already seeing newspaper articles saying the Batman fad is over. Like the ratings have already dropped. The merchandising sales already seem to have kind of plateaued or tailed off. So it's a really interesting phenomenon because it has such a cultural kind of permanence where the catchphrases are still well known. I think you can invoke the Batman series now and people know what you mean, even if they don't know the series. But really, it was such a short-lived program, and the first 2, it was 3 seasons in total. But really, the 3rd season, they changed the format. So West's signature role stardom are quite closely linked to the first 2 seasons in particular. And you can even go quite narrower and say the first season alone. And really, you're looking at a couple of months in 1966 where his stardom was at its zenith before it really quickly kind of tails off. And I think merchandising is definitely an aspect of that because it was such a kind of short-lived fad. Yeah.
Derek's got his hand up. Do you want to go, Derek? What's your question?
I loved both papers. Great to see people digging into archive research. Great to see stuff about Batman. Obviously, always. I've got lots of. This is a comment in terms of things that you might have thought about or associations, but I'll keep those aside for the moment. And I do have a question for each of you, if that's okay. Looks to Brett. Okay. Carl, I was wondering how important the Batman movie was, because that was already set up when they started the series, wasn't it? They were lined up to do that from the beginning.
Yeah, so this was one of the casualties of my word count limit, I'm afraid. Yeah, so the Batman series spawned a spin-off feature film that aired between the 1st and 2nd seasons. So it comes out in the summer break. I believe it's I'm not sure if it's the first, but it must be one of the first television series that did something like that. It was, I think, kind of that, like I say, that fad had already peaked and the film did okay, but not spectacularly. I think what West says in his autobiography is that he really he kind of negotiated a salary increase for the film, first of all. And he wanted to use the film to demonstrate that he could do more than the television series was allowing him to show. So in the film, there are more scenes with him as Bruce Wayne. He has kind of a romantic subplot with Catwoman, which is played by Lee Merriweather. I think it's Julie Newmar, first of all, in the TV series, Lee Merriweather for the film, and then Eartha Kitt as Catwoman for the third season of the show. So he gets a bit more to do as Bruce Wayne, and he's trying to show, he's a dynamic romantic lead and so on. And then when I've looked at reviews of the Batman film from the time, most people don't really pick up on that. There's not much of a sense that the Batman film did enhance his star presence. I think I did see one review, though, which did praise him, and it said you might come away with a new appreciation of Adam West, but that really wasn't reflected elsewhere. So you get this very strange, his importance to the Batman phenomenon is very variably situated in 1966. And that's the case in US reviews, UK reviews, reviews of the film. Sometimes he's seen as being quite important. Sometimes he's seen as, he looks the part, he fits the cape quite well. Sometimes they don't refer to him at all, which I found quite strange, really, because when you go back these days, it's referred to as like Adam West's Batman. He has has more of a sense of ownership about it than there was at the time.
Yeah, I think I was particularly wondering because in relation to, as Karen was saying, about going into syndication faster and so getting the repeats. But if you've also got a film which presumably, it's not the same short release window, it's going around the circuits and then it's going international. Yeah. And I'm thinking you particularly with the going into syndication, you're seeing a similar thing with Star Trek, which arguably you had both Nimoy and Shatner as similar figures who've big other careers like West, but they're so associated with single roles.
Absolutely,
The question I wanted to ask Karen, sorry, before, as I see that Elka's got her.
No, go for it, Derek, and then I'll go to Elka.
Did you have a chance to look at the writers' bibles of any of those other network series that they were comparing themselves with? Because, basically, was everyone saying we're different from everyone else, or was it just these particular programs?
Okay, so here is where, for me, things get really fascinating. I am arguing that these shows constitute, kind of a loose genre, right? But I'm arguing that based on the fact that the people who made these shows, they felt that association. Critics at the time, they saw that association. So when you wanted to make a new show, like let's say Breaking Point, the psychiatric drama, George Lefferts would market that as, well, this is like The Defenders, but set in the world of psychiatry, right? And so the people who are involved in making these shows are definitely identifying these ties where you wouldn't, as a viewer, necessarily go like, oh, this court show is a lot like this psychiatric drama. But the people who are producing it would say it is. And it's also part of the critical commentary at the time, where when critics watch a new show like, let me pick something that's not Breaking Point. When critics watch a new show like Channing, they're like, oh, well, this show is set in a college, but really this is like the college version of Dr. Kildare, where you have the young English professor and his mentor is the cranky dean. And it's like the same model, different type of show. Now, if you look at the writer's guides for different types of shows. I have the guide for writers and directors of Star Trek, for example. I have the guide for writers of the Bing Crosby show, which is kind of my favorite. And when you look at those guides, the writers of the Bing Crosby show say, hey, there's one thing we've got going on, and it's selling Bing Crosby. So like anything you can do to be funny in that realm is totally fine. This guy does not say anything about like we're a quality show trying to be different from anything else on TV. We've got one goal, sell Bing Crosby, right? And so there is, I find, a commonality in the writer's guides of the professional drama where they're repeating over and over again, authenticity, accuracy. We want this to be as realistic as possible. We want people responding to the human drama. It's not a disease of the week or a case of the week or a guest star of the week. We want real human emotions, and that's why people are going to love this show. So I hope that answers your question. but I probably could say a lot more about it. I know that Elka wants to ask a question, but let me just say quickly, Kenneth in the chat says that the producers of Dr. Kildare missed a trick on merchandise. Dr. Kildare starred Richard Chamberlain, and they were trying so hard to support Richard Chamberlain's like developing career across all avenues. He was a singer, and they were marketing like Richard Chamberlain albums. When it was possible, Dr. Kildare episodes would incorporate like popular music. They would have an artist write a song for the show, and then they would market that single as like, as heard on Dr. Kildare, you know. And the producers of professional dramas felt that that was another way to market a show. Even if you're not going to go into a record store, because you're not 12 years old, you're not going to go into a record store and buy this single from Dr. Kildare. You're going to go to a record store to buy something, and you're going to see it there on the shelf, and it helps to sell Dr. Kildare, even if you don't buy it, right? Novelization of all of these television shows, maybe you're not going to buy that book, but you're at the bookstore and you see it on the shelf, and it helps to sell East Side, West Side. All right, so I'll stop talking.
Thanks. We're getting some Richard Chamberlain love in the chat, so that's good to know. Elke, your question.
I just realised I need to unmute myself, don't I? Excellent papers, thank you both. My question is for Karen. The thing that I wonder about is there any evidence that these programs were kind of used by the networks as well in order to precisely position themselves in more positive terms versus the FCC, versus the government, etc., etc. So were these programs really used in a way kind of for legitimization purposes? You know, we were talking so much about legitimization, so maybe.
The best brief story here is The Defenders. So CBS in 1960 had spent a huge amount of upfront money to develop The Defenders, and it was based on a Studio One episode starring William Shatner, right? Called The Defender, right? CBS put a lot, $50 million into developing this television show. And then they developed it and they didn't want to air it, and they didn't put it on the schedule. And so multiple historians, including Marianne Watson, who wrote The Expanding Vista, and she interviewed a lot of these people from the Newton Minnow FCC era, tell the story like this. CBS sat on it for a year. They weren't putting it on the schedule. They weren't going to air it. They had plenty of hits. However, William Paley, the network owner, was called to do government testimony. And so this congressional committee was looking into television quality, and William Paley wanted to be able to tell them something like, we're doing something. This is after the Vast Wasteland speech. And William Paley said to Jim Aubrey, who's the network president, whatever happened to that show, The Defenders? Where's that? Let's put that on the schedule. So Jim Aubrey hated it, and William Paley supported it. And supposedly that's how it ended up on the schedule, because there was a congressional investigation into television quality, and CBS wanted to say, you know, we're doing something. So at the same time, same congressional testimony, Norman Felton was like, well, we're making Dr. Kildare, which hasn't premiered yet, and it meets all of these goals that you're talking about. Like, it wasn't made to address these criticisms, but it does address all these criticisms. It meets all of these goals. So The Defenders is probably the best story along those lines. But what happens is everything in the network era, when something is popular, you try to like imitate that success, right? So you have 3 popular shows in 1961, and that means 1963 is the season where there's really a glut of these professional dramas. There's 2 psychiatric dramas, there's a high school drama and a college drama, and the nurses drama and multiple medical dramas. There's a ton of these shows. And so then by that point, it kind of diminishes the audience for any one of them. And then you start to see the decline of the cycle.
Thanks, Karen. If I can ask a question, though, I do just want to note Christine's comment in the chat about Dr. Kildare being too soppy. And it's interesting how those things change, because that's how I remember it, as that it was a soppy program. So it's interesting that it had the history that you've outlined there, Karen, in terms of kind of realism, and it's not how it kind of sits in my head in terms of kind of popular memory. Yeah, Carl, there's a question I wanted to ask you about repeats, which you mentioned in terms of relationship to stardom, and which Derek briefly picked up on as well. And it's a funny thing because I don't know that we talk about repeats enough when it's such a core component of television as a form. And it's not something I'd really reflected on, so it's really useful that you've noted it. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about the relationship between repeats and specifically television stardom and the ways in which that might kind of disrupt the assumptions and methods of star studies, which you transported across kind of from film studies, but have also said it works kind of slightly differently. And then if this is fair on a panel about television history, so you can tell me if it's not fair, I'm now wondering how that works today. And this is not to say repeats don't exist now, but they exist very differently, and I think we don't encounter them across television schedules. I'm talking from a UK context, in the way in which I would have done as a child. We can construct our own sets of repeats and watch the same programs repeatedly, but it's not necessarily part of broadcasting. And I'm wondering whether, and I say this might be unfair on a history panel to ask about the present.
Yeah.
Does our relationship to repeats now affect notions of television stardom now?
I suppose it must. I think the main difference, when I was a kid growing up in the early 90s, I grew fond of a number of television programs because I watched them in repeats. And the only reason I watched them in repeats was because there was nothing else on. It wasn't that I had an affinity with the subject matter or the stars or anything like that. These days I look at my own children and they can just watch exactly what pleases them. They don't have to seek out older forms in the same way. So I need to think about that more in terms of how that affects contemporary stardom, but I think there must be something there. In terms of the Batman series, so it's 120 episodes over 2.5 years that were produced, so it was a lot. So I think, like I say, when Jermin talks about Sarah Jessica Parker and she talks about how a television star has a more particular relationship with a single role than a film star would, I think it's very true. But I think if you look at Sex and the City as an example, there's one season of Sex and the City which has only 8 episodes. The second season of Batman has 60 episodes. So I think that sort of interrelationship is much closer with older stars. Yeah, in terms of Batman, I'll give you one story in terms of repeats. I think in 1988 in the UK, there was some kind of technician strike. And it meant that ITN, the breakfast show, I think it was Good Morning Britain, it had to go off the air because the technicians were on strike. And the way ITV got around it was they started showing Batman repeats. And what happened was that increased viewing figures for the channel, actually. So it became, again, a recurrent fad. What that meant for Adam West was that he was suddenly in demand for like talk show appearances and things in the UK. He became a regular guest on Good Morning Britain when the technicians were back off strike and that kind of thing. So you see he comes back into focus at various points to do with Batman, whether it's to do with, Tim Burton's made a film, West has published his autobiography, repeats have picked up some traction, and these things, they kind of are interrelated. When the Burton film comes out, I had some stat somewhere, the number of markets in the US where Batman, the 60s show, is being repeated increases quite significantly, for instance. So yeah, I think very significant to his star image, and it seemed to have a rejuvenating effect on his image whenever Batman would come back into the consciousness. Not quite repeats, but for instance, when his book comes out, I've read some of the interviews with him, and there's I think it's the Asbury Park Press kind of follows him around on a day where he's touring the studios and that kind of thing. And it says that he goes into a Planet Hollywood restaurant and it's announced over the tannoy that Adam West is in the building, and everybody just goes crazy, So I think repeats would be one aspect of, this kind of pendulum effect where West stardom kind of ebbs and flows and sometimes comes back quite significantly.
Okay, thanks. Christine's got her hand up.
Yes, just I'm just still reflecting about the business of television and how we theorize stardom, or whatever that, Carl, you began with, Richard Dyer, of course. I think one of the things about the unease about using stardom in relation to television was that television covered such a wide range of formats and genres. And so, on the one hand, you might have Barry Norman as a star because he's presenting film today or whatever it was. Yeah. On the other hand, you've got newsreaders who become stars, and on the other hand, you've got actors who become stars. And and using the same term for all those kind of different manifestations didn't seem quite right, though perhaps it was. But if we focus on the actors, so you've got Adam West and Karen, obviously you've got the gorgeous Richard Chamberlain, among other stars. Those series were about stars as well as issues. But I wonder, in relation to long-running serials and television, do actors become stars by playing different roles? Do they have to have at some point, a different role in order to make the comparison? As would seem to be the case with West, who seems to emerge to be a star as he tries and fails to take on other personas. Or is it possible to sit in your soap opera for years and years and years and become a star in the same way as Dyer is describing in his use of stars? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I think so. I think just on the term star, so I think you're right. Yeah, the thing where weather forecasters are referred to as stars. I think it's quite helpful sometimes to make that distinction between stars and personalities, where I think using the term stars to refer to actors in fictional programming is quite a good way to set that up, I think, and personalities for your weather forecasters and so on. I think it's quite a decent way to go ahead. Yeah, I think there has been some scholarship on things like soap opera actors, and I think you always see certain phrases or certain ways of framing it pop up. I think Jeremy Butler writes about soap stars being imprisoned by their characters and that kind of thing. I think I've read about sitcom stars being frozen in time because they play a particular character. I think there's to some extent, the strong relationship with a single character can strengthen an image as well as hinder it, is what I'm saying. I think definitely with somebody like West, it can be an inhibiting factor. And I think there was quite a long period of time, probably through the late 60s, the 70s, into the 80s, where if you'd have said to him, how has Batman affected your career? He would have described it in terms that said, it's limited it, basically. I should never have played it, I think he said at one point in the 70s. But I think it can work the other way as well. And I think he kind of re-emerges into the consciousness, and you get these kind of wider paradigm shifts that are relevant to it. The wider culture becomes a bit more self-referential. In addition to that, things like superhero narratives become a bit more firmly embedded in popular culture. And I think these things kind of work to his advantage. And in his latter-day career, he was able to emerge. So, for instance, you see he was quite a big draw on the convention circuit, pop culture conventions and things. And I've read articles about things like San Diego Comic-Con and that kind of thing, where there's no distinction made between like Adam West, Harrison Ford, Francis Ford Coppola. These people are all discussed as being big crowd pullers, big crowd pleasers. And it seemed like his particular persona, which was very closely tied to Batman. So he's reproducing elements of this persona in Comic Cons and that kind of thing. So he's got this core persona that was formulated at some, 50 years earlier, and it still serves him well up until the 2010s. So, yeah, I think Dyer's theory can be tweaked to accommodate that, because he was kind of presupposing that a star would have a succession of separate roles. But I think a lot of his other I think that doesn't mean that it can't be adjusted to accommodate that. I think people, Dyer was writing about human subjects, but people have applied his subjects to animals. I think there are ways to get around it. I think he said that as long as you respect the specificities of whether it's a different medium or a different way of looking at it, that's the key thing, I think. Sorry, that's a quick way.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Karen, do you want to respond to that in terms of Chamberlain or others?
Well, I would throw in a couple of things that I think are factors. I think there is a difference from the audience perspective. I think there's a difference between a superhero character and, like, I sometimes call the leads in these professional dramas everyday heroes. There's an everydayness about them that is antithetical to stardom. Like, that's the opposite thing. And so if you look back at the 60s newspaper articles about James Franciscus, who played Mr. Novak, and Chamberlain, who played Kildare, and Vince Edwards, who played Ben Casey, they'll tell stories like, oh, people come up to me and they, expect me to have insight into their medical problems. They think of me as the doctor on TV who meets with all these people, and they're a person who has a problem and maybe I could help them. And that's different from being seen as a star. There's an everydayness. Television as a living room medium, that's part of it. It's, just, part of the atmosphere of the household. And Dr. Kildare seems like a doctor. And if I saw him out in public, I'd talk to him like he was a doctor. And that's totally separate from the kind of star discourse where you see somebody as a superhero and you react to them with awe, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
So
Sorry.
No, I just was going to say, I think there's, different facets that play a role there.
I think the idea of the ordinary and the extraordinary can come into play there, because I think that both Ellis and Dyer doesn't call it the ordinary and the extraordinary, but he calls it the stars as ordinary, stars as special, which is a very similar thing, I think. Both Dyer and Ellis sort of hint at the fact that you can relocate this within the fictional diegesis, but it's normally meant to refer to like publicity artifacts. But I think there's precedent for really looking at a fictional narrative in this way. So I think, a lot of the stars I'm thinking of, actually, someone like Shatner, Nimoy, West, Linda Carter, I think you can sort of see this blend of the ordinary and the extraordinary to do with the fantasticness of their narratives. So it's really interesting in Batman because it works in quite complex ways. So on the one hand, you have Bruce Wayne, who's like this dashing millionaire, and he's, putting his costume on, he's going to save Gotham City. But he's probably the most dull millionaire you'll ever see, because whenever we pick up with him, he's looking at his stamp collection, or he's doing a jigsaw puzzle, or giving some really boring civics lesson to Robin, that kind of thing. So Batman's a fascinating series because the ordinary and the extraordinary is relevant in so many ways. Like you have this the visual style, which is very pop art with the garish colors, giant props, that kind of thing. And there's kind of a split where the Batman and Robin scenes are filmed more conventionally. So there's ordinariness, quite standard visual style in some ways. And then you go to the villain's lair and you've got a tilted camera angle and you've got, a more extraordinariness through that way. So, I think that's a relevant point. I think there are certain series which facilitate this comparison with the ordinary and extraordinary. And it might not be found in all forms of television programming. I think that's fair.
Is it all right? Because there's a question I was going to ask which connects to that. Though I was going to ask you, Karen, about the aesthetics of these programs that you were talking about, and those kind of Bibles, those guidebooks of how to write them, and that idea of kind of sophisticated storytelling. I love the fact that the history of television is people insisting that the programs they're making are better than all other television, which is still the discourse today. Television's rubbish apart from what I'm doing. But so that. I was wondering, in those guides, so you said they were about kind of storytelling and character and all that kind of stuff. Is there anything in there about the aesthetics of what these programs look like, and therefore guidance that's given to writers about how they might write characters or scenes that lends itself to aesthetics? Is there much discussion of the look of these programs?
There is not much discussion beyond, well, okay. So one of the things that I did not define very clearly in my paper here, in terms of the relationship to the anthology programs and the people who originated these film shows, they're coming out of those anthologies, right? So I would argue what they were looking to do was to develop a storytelling format that could essentially have almost as much freedom as the anthology, where for an anthology, you could write anything. It's going to be stage bound, but you can write any kind of story, right? And so what we want to do is have continuing appeal. So you can write any kind of story as long as it involves something medical. It doesn't have to be inside the hospital. It could be outside the hospital, but still be a medical problem. We can be inside and outside. We want to have that flexibility, right? But like the hospital is our environment and a doctor is our central character. The hospital is our environment and nurses are our central character. I think the expectation from the point of view of producers is after we have a couple of episodes on the air, the freelance writers who write for the show are going to know the look of this series. And so what we're laying down on paper is our aims. If you're going to write a story for us, like here are the central characters you have to involve. And, you can have my favorite, the Moser example, approximately 2/3 personal story, approximately 1/3 medical story. Like we've got a mathematical formula for that mix. Moser doesn't talk about the look of the show, but like he absolutely had an aesthetic, a gritty, realist aesthetic. He spent 6 months living in a hospital with interns and studying neurosurgery and that kind of stuff. And he wanted his show to be the most realistic looking thing on television. But the writer's guide does not get into that. And I think he doesn't expect writers to have a say in that.
Okay, thank you. I don't think there's any other hands up. So there's another question I wanted to ask, if that's okay, but I'm just checking that there aren't hands up or anything in the chat. other than Derek announcing that Tom Baker's going to die. So thanks, Derek. It's good of you to let us all know that.
Or maybe not.
Anyway, there's a question. If I can take this in a completely different direction, but it does connect back to a number of other sessions where there's been lots of discussion about how we introduce kind of ideas to students in teaching and that kind of thing. And I'm wondering if both of you could reflect on teaching television history to students, whether they find watching this kind of stuff really difficult, or whether they like it, or techniques that you've got, or anything to do with that. It'd be really interesting to know the kind of programs that you talked about, Karen. I think also Batman as well. I'd be nervous about putting in front of students because I don't know how they would think of them. Yeah. So I don't know if you want to kind of reflect on your experiences of teaching these, or what you've seen that kind of students' responses are, if that's okay. Karen, do you want to go first?
I would say I have shown my students some of the dramas. And so I have shown, for example, the abortion episode of The Defenders, which I think is still pretty surprising. And my students and I had a good discussion of it. I used it to contrast with something contemporary. It was for a television genres course. And so we were looking at, like the genre of the courtroom drama in the 1960s versus something contemporary, which was The Good Wife on CBS at the time. And so we talked about, like the handling of controversial issues and how that works. And I think they found The Defenders really surprising in terms of you have a mental expectation that if I go back more than 50 years, television is going to be very hesitant, very avoidant of taboo topics. And The Defenders is a very direct discussion, right? But more than showing the episodes, I would say that I have found it valuable to show my students documents on a regular basis. And so tying back into our earlier conversation today, I have a document that I just found this summer that is about the one season psychiatric drama, The Breaking Point. And it's a breakdown of the money it made. Okay. And it made money. It didn't make money. It lost money. All right. And my students are going to love looking at this, and I can't wait to show it to them. It didn't make money. It lost money because it only aired for one season. And so it had its network money that it brought in. And then they did limited sales of it to other countries. And so I have this document that lists out, like in Argentina, they were watching the US psychiatric drama Breaking Point, and they got a really good deal on it. Okay. After all of these sales to foreign countries, Breaking Point was still in the hole more than $1 million. Like it lost more than $1 million after being on the air for a season. And something like that is really going to help my students understand the economics of the system more than just me saying, like, here's how the money worked. It's something that's going to really illustrate it. And I can't wait to use it in the classroom.
Okay, thank you. Carl?
Yeah, so for me, to be honest, there've been 2 occasions where I've been asked to teach a module about television, and both times I've been tasked with teaching about contemporary quality TV. Now, on one occasion, though, I did sneak in. I thought we need to cover some early TV before we get to Hill Street Blues and beyond that. So we didn't look at Batman. We looked at I Love Lucy, and I found students really responded really well to both the episode we watched, some clips of Lucille Ball in other episodes, and just her story about how, the whole thing about Desilu Productions and transferring from film to radio to television and so on. So that worked really well. I don't know with Batman. It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because Batman, the interesting thing about it was a mainstream hit that fans of the actual Batman character often despised because they didn't think it was an authentic take on the source material on the comics. So I wonder how that attitude has changed over time. I really don't know. It'd be a fascinating one to find out.
Well, and students would be coming at it from a primary reference point, I think, that would be Christian Bale as Batman, right? Like, I don't think they think of Ben Affleck as Batman. I think probably,
Yeah.
And so, like, these very dark contemporary, like, versions of Batman would be the primary reference point. And then watching, I would imagine there would be a lot of giggling. I'm not sure. I think they'd probably think it was pretty funny.
And I wonder if they would know Adam West more from his role in Family Guy, where he was on that show for like a decade and a half or something, more so than they would think of him as Batman. That would be very interesting too, because that would kind of contradict what I'm saying in a lot of ways. Yeah.
I mean, I would guess for a lot of students, they wouldn't, as you say, because Family Guy doesn't mention Batman, they wouldn't know that at all. He's just some weird bloke on Family Guy. Yeah, not knowing that history. I am now really enjoying the chat and everyone confessing to the things they've made their students watch. And whether we have to have some therapy that we have to have that to deal with the fact of how but it's interesting. I think we do we worry about that stuff as a community, don't we? How are students going to make kind of sense of this, particularly if it's a thing that kind of matters to you and which you really want them to get a particular thing out of it, and they just go, what is this nonsense? But anyway, maybe that's just me. We're out of time, unfortunately. So thank you to Carl and Corin for the fantastic papers and for the brilliant, really thoughtful contribution to the discussion. And thanks to everyone else for attending. Elka, have you got any announcements you have to make before the end of this session?
Not really. Obviously, we've got the next session not until Monday, which is an early session, so probably too early for Karen, but because it's we have a speaker from Singapore this time around, so in order to match their time zone, it's early. And otherwise, the only thing I wanted to ask is, Owen, was there anything in the chat that you think we should have asked that we missed?
No, I can't see any other questions. All of them have been answered.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Right, so I'll invite everybody to join me in thanking Carl and Karen. It's a bit weird because we can't do that via emojis or anything. We just have to do this kind of clapping on screen for those who are visible. But thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was a super enjoyable discussion. So I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day.
You too.
Yep. Thanks.
Bye.
And then we stare at each other.